Hey everybody, it's me, Solo. Today I've got a pretty fundamental lesson for you, something that pretty much every artist should learn as soon as possible: lighting. In this video I'm going to cover things more or less in order of complexity, starting with the basics and moving up into more advanced techniques. I'm going to try to be as explicit as possible, but if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments or at me on Twitter. So the first thing to remember about lighting for illustration, at least digitally, is that it's easier to start out if you think of any given light source as a single point or mass that sends out an arbitrary number of rays, quote-unquote, in every conceivable direction, and whatever those rays touch is considered to be lit. Because that's how it works, really. Of course, I'm not going to go into the science of light here. That's definitely a topic for another day, and I am not a scientist. So let's start out with a simple, practical example. Let's assume you've got a primitive cube and only a single light source. First, you determine where in your scene your light source is going to be, and locate the side that's most perpendicular to the direction your light is pointing. In this case, it's going to be this one. That's the face that's going to be the most brightly lit. If you're working with a scene that only has one solitary light source, no reflections and no ambient light, sometimes that's going to be the only surface that's lit. In this case, though, we're just going to paint the faces that are just receiving some light with about 50% of the brightness of the strongly lit side. It's not out of formula or anything, just fool around with it until it looks good if you're doing your own scene. Doing the same thing with a sphere is arguably even more simple. Just find the point on the surface that's most directly facing your light source and give it a nice circular gradient fade. No need to be all precise about the particular percentage in each location, just pick the part that looks right and hit it with a nice soft brush, if that's your style, of course. You can apply this technique in almost all cases. The only difference is how strong the light source is and whether or not it's drowned out by others. Speaking of which, let's try adding another light source. The basic principle behind lighting an object from a direct source is going to be pretty much the same no matter how many you have in your scene. In this case, we're going to add a light of a contrasting color in order to display how this works. Okay, so as before, let's just pick a spot on the canvas and say our light comes from that direction. In this case, I'm going to put it over here. Now let's just pick the face that's most perpendicular to our light source, and that one's going to take the most brightness and color from our new light source. Easy peasy. Keep in mind that in cases where multiple light sources hit the same surface, the resulting color will be different from either one. Just do a bit of color blending to show this. If you're really unsure as to what color the end result should be, you can cheat a little. Pick a bit of canvas to the side and put down one color blob, and then slap the other, overlapping it with an overlay brush style, which you can find the option to do this in Photoshop right up here. So now that we've got the basic principles out of the way, the following parts are actually going to be pretty easy. This one, for example, ambient lighting is basically the color of whatever the, ambient light is in any given scene. For example, a room with windows during the daytime, that's usually going to be a very, very soft bluish white at a very low opacity. The color and intensity of any ambient light is always going to be determined by the surfaces in your environment. If you're in a field of bright green grass, add a tiny bit of pale green to the ambience. If you're in a firelit tavern, some warm, dark hues would be best. Just find the most dominant color in your scene, determine its intensity, and work from there. Make sure you apply that to every surface, not just the surfaces that are most revealed by the direct light. Now here's where the fun stuff starts. It's important to remember that the reason an object appears to have color is because it's reflecting that frequency from the spectrum of visible light and absorbing the rest. So when you've got, say, a bright red rubber ball, there's going to be a certain amount of red light that's going to be reflected and scattered away from that ball onto its surroundings and the surfaces around it, and into our eyes, which is why we can even see it in the first place, mind you. The brighter an object appears, the more light it puts out into its environment, and that includes onto the surfaces around it. I'm just going to show a quick practical example here. And then in the next segment, I'm going to bring in everything we've learned during this video. So let's put that aforementioned red rubber ball next to a bland gray cube in a well-lit environment. We've got the primary light source up here, and a secondary one over here. Our ambient light is going to be just as gray as the rest of the environment, so there aren't going to be extremely harsh shadows, just some mild ones. Now let's make sure to gauge the distance that the rubber red ball is from the surface of our gray cube, and apply a bit of color here. Now let's gauge the distance that it is from the floor, so to speak. And you find the brightest surface on the side of the ball, the one that's perpendicular to our brightest source of light, and we're going to scatter a bit of light down here. There we go. Don't forget to factor in our secondary light source, of course. There is going to be a bit of scatter of red light on that side as well. And there we go. As usual, if you have any questions or want me to elaborate on anything, go ahead and email me or post in the comments or at me on Twitter. Remember, practice makes perfect. Sort of. Eventually. I'll see you next time.